A helpless German Shepherd puppy was about to be put down until a veteran read its collar. But what he found wasn't just a name. It was a forgotten promise, a battlefield memory, a fallen soldier, and a brotherhood oath no one was supposed to remember. If that soldier never came home, why does this puppy seem to recognize military commands? What if this isn't just a stray, but the key to healing invisible wounds? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching. From today, the rain hammered against the metal roof of Pinewood Animal Shelter as Marcus Reed filed paperwork for the day's intakes. Water streamed down the windows, creating rhythmic patterns that matched his methodical movements. His shoulders ached from a grueling 10-hour shift that included processing 12 new arrivals and cleaning every kennel in the overcrowded facility. The shelter was well beyond capacity, a common situation in the weeks following major holidays when the novelty of Christmas puppies had worn off. "Just 30 more minutes," he muttered to himself, stamping the final form with more force than necessary. The ancient wall clock showed 7:30 p.m., and he could already taste the cold beer waiting in his refrigerator. After 8 years working at the shelter, Marcus had learned to compartmentalize, to do the job effectively without letting the daily heartbreak consume him. But some days were harder than others, and today had pushed his emotional defenses to their limits. 3 perfectly healthy 2-year-old labs had been surrendered because their family was moving somewhere that doesn't allow pets. 5 puppies from an accidental litter were dropped off in a cardboard box, and tomorrow's euthanasia list had grown to 7 animals, all due to space constraints rather than medical or behavioral issues. It was the part of the job that hollowed him out, that made him question why he stayed. The front door burst open with a gust of cold air and driving rain, making Marcus instinctively reach for the intake forms. Officer Carlos Diaz stumbled in, his animal control uniform soaked through. In his arms, wrapped in a wet blanket, was a trembling bundle of tan and black fur. "Reed," Carlos said, water dripping from his department cap onto the linoleum floor. "I know you're closing up, but I didn't know where else to go." Marcus's exhaustion momentarily lifted as he took in the state of both Carlos and his furry charge. "What have you got there?" he asked, already reaching for a dry towel from the stack behind the counter. Carlos carefully unwrapped the blanket, revealing a German Shepherd puppy that couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 months old. Its fur was matted with mud and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. One ear stood up in the classic shepherd pose, while the other flopped forward, giving the pup a perpetually confused expression. Despite its bedraggled appearance, the puppy's amber eyes were alert and surprisingly calm, given the circumstances. "Found this little guy tied to a fence behind the abandoned military surplus store on Cypress Road," Carlos explained, gratefully handing the pup to Marcus, who immediately began drying it with the fresh towel. No food, no water, just left there. In the pouring rain, someone called it in, thought it was injured from the way it was lying there. The puppy trembled under Marcus's gentle ministrations, but made no sound of protest. "Is it hurt?" Marcus asked, his trained eyes already scanning for visible injuries. Carlos shook his head. "Don't think so. Exhausted, hungry, probably been out. And there for days, but no wounds that I could see. Didn't even try to bite when I picked him up." Marcus continued drying the puppy, noticing how it leaned into his touch rather than pulling away. "Well, you know the situation here," he said, unable to keep the resignation from his voice. "We're over capacity by 15 already. Tomorrow's list is—" "I know, man," Carlos interrupted, his expression grim. "Believe me, I wouldn't bring you another one if I had any other options. Animal control holding area is under renovation. All the foster homes are full with kitten season, and the rescue groups are tapped out." The puppy let out a small whimper that seemed to cut through the practical realities of shelter mathematics. Despite his professional detachment, Marcus felt something tug inside his chest. The pup's eyes seemed to hold an intelligence, an awareness. that made it harder to think of it as just another intake statistic. "Marcus," Carlos said quietly, using his first name instead of his surname, a rarity in their professional relationship. "I've got 3 more calls to respond to tonight. If you can't take him..." The unsaid conclusion hung in the air between them. Without proper processing time, without evaluation and marketing to potential adopters, animals that came in this late often went straight to the next day's euthanasia list. Marcus sighed heavily, his hands still mechanically drying the puppy's fur. "Bring me the intake forms," he said, avoiding Carlos's gaze. "I'll process him tonight, give him a chance at least." Relief washed over Carlos's face. "You're a good man, Reed. I owe you one." "You owe me about 50 at this point," Marcus grumbled, but there was no real heat behind his words. As Carlos filled out the necessary paperwork, Marcus continued his impromptu examination of the puppy. Despite the matted fur and signs of neglect, the animal appeared to be purebred, probably worth a significant amount of money to whoever had originally purchased it. How does someone just abandon a dog like this? Marcus wondered aloud, carefully checking the puppy's ears and paws for signs of injury or infection. The pup remained remarkably still during the examination, only occasionally licking Marcus's wrist as if in gratitude. "People surprise you," Carlos replied, his pen scratching against the clipboard. "And not usually in good ways." As Marcus's hands moved through the puppy's thick fur, his fingers brushed against something solid beneath the matted coat around its neck. Parting the fur revealed a tarnished metal tag attached to what remained of a sturdy nylon collar, most of which had worn away, leaving just enough to hold the identification. "He's got a tag," Marcus said, excitement creeping into his voice despite his fatigue. A tag meant an owner, which meant this might be a lost pet rather than an abandoned one. It could mean one less animal on tomorrow's list. Carlos looked up from the paperwork. "Can you read it?" Marcus squinted at the metal disc, turning it to catch better light. Years of dirt and corrosion made the engraving difficult to decipher. He reached for the glasses he used for paperwork, but rarely wore otherwise, not wanting to admit that at 42, his eyes weren't what they used to be. "It's military," he said with surprise, recognizing the format immediately. The tag wasn't a typical pet ID, but rather mimicked military dog tags. "There's a name and what looks like a service number." Carlos moved closer, interest piqued. "Lost service dog, maybe?" "Not with a pup this young," Marcus replied, still trying to make out. "The details might be someone's attempt at making a cute ID tag for their pet. You know, like those dog of valor tags they sell at the surplus store." The puppy's ears perked up at that phrase, its head tilting slightly as if responding to familiar words. Marcus paused, looking directly into those intelligent amber eyes. There was something there, something that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the warmth of the shelter. "Let me see if I can clean this up," Marcus said, reaching for some rubbing alcohol and a cotton ball. As he gently wiped away years of grime from the metal surface, letters began to emerge more clearly. SGT, J. Sullivan. 75th Ranger, Regiment, if found, return to Unit Sentinel Promise. Below these words was a string of numbers that Marcus assumed was a service identification of some kind. The tag looked authentic, not like the novelty items sold in military surplus shops, but the phrase Sentinel Promise was unfamiliar to him despite his own military background. "That's odd," Marcus muttered, turning the tag over. The reverse side contained a phone number with an area code he didn't recognize. "Got a name at least," Carlos said, finishing the intake form. "Should I put Sullivan as his name for now?" Marcus nodded absently, his mind already spinning with questions. Why would someone put a genuine-looking military tag on a puppy? And what was the Sentinel Promise referenced on the tag? Something about it felt significant, important in a way he couldn't articulate. The puppy chose that moment to place one paw on Marcus's arm, as if trying to recapture his attention. Those amber eyes locked with his again, and Marcus felt that strange sensation return, a sort of recognition that made no logical sense. "I'm going to make a couple calls," Marcus said, finally breaking eye contact with the pup. "See if I can track down this Sergeant Sullivan. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation for all this." Carlos glanced at his watch and grimaced. "I've got to get back out there. Those calls won't answer themselves." He hesitated at the door, looking back at the puppy who was now sitting calmly beside Marcus. "You'll let me know what happens with this one?" "Yeah," Marcus promised, already reaching for the shelter's phone. "Stay safe out there." After Carlos left, Marcus spent the next hour making calls that led nowhere. The phone number on the back of the tag was disconnected. The Army Rangers Public Affairs Office was closed for the evening. The local veterans organizations had no record of a Sergeant Sullivan in their membership. Even his buddy at the VA hospital couldn't access records without proper authorization. As the clock ticked past 9, well beyond closing time, Marcus found himself sitting on the floor of the intake room, the puppy curled against his leg. Despite being in a strange place after a traumatic day, the dog had settled with surprising ease, only occasionally lifting its head to track Marcus's movements. "What's your story, buddy?" Marcus asked softly, scratching behind the puppy's ears. "Who's Sergeant Sullivan, and why did he leave you behind?" The puppy's tail thumped once against the floor, but otherwise it maintained that same steady gaze that seemed to look straight through Marcus's carefully constructed professional barriers. 8 years at the shelter had taught Marcus not to get emotionally involved. Name them by intake number, not with personal names. Don't make eye contact for too long. Don't imagine them in your home. These were the unwritten rules of survival in a job where you sometimes had to make impossible choices. But something about this puppy, about the mystery surrounding, it had already slipped past his defenses. With a sigh of surrender, Marcus made a decision he would probably regret. "Come on, Sullivan," he said, rising to his feet. "You're coming home with me tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out who you really belong to." The puppy, now temporarily named Sullivan, immediately stood, tail wagging with newfound energy, as Marcus gathered his things and led the dog to his truck. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger than a simple case of a lost pet. The military tag felt heavy in his pocket, its mysteries still waiting to be unraveled. What Marcus Reed didn't know, couldn't know, was that his simple act of compassion had just set in motion a chain of events that would uncover a promise made on a battlefield half a world away, a brotherhood forged in fire, and secrets that powerful people had worked very hard to keep buried. For now, though, it was just a man and a dog driving through the rain toward home, both carrying invisible wounds, both searching for something they couldn't quite name. The morning light filtered through faded blinds as Marcus Reed jolted awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight pressed against his leg. He blinked away the remnants of sleep, to find Sullivan curled up at the foot of his bed, amber eyes already open and watching him with that same unnerving intelligence from the night before. "How did you get up here?" Marcus mumbled, pushing himself upright. He distinctly remembered making a bed for the puppy on the floor of his living room, complete with an old blanket and a makeshift water bowl. Sullivan's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, but the dog made no move to leave the comfortable spot he'd claimed. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly, as if questioning why this was even an issue worth discussing. Marcus ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, a habit left over from his military days, despite the fact that it had grown out considerably. In the 8 years since his discharge, the digital clock on his nightstand showed 5:43 a.m., 17 minutes before his alarm was set to go off. With a resigned sigh, He swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing at the familiar stiffness in his right knee. "Might as well get moving," he told Sullivan, who immediately jumped down and stood at attention beside the bed. The puppy's sudden shift from relaxed to alert caught Marcus's attention. It wasn't the normal, excited bouncing of a young dog anticipating breakfast, but something more disciplined, more purposeful. On a hunch, Marcus straightened his posture and said in a clear, firm voice, "Heel." Without hesitation, Sullivan moved to his left side and sat, eyes forward, completely still, except for the slight tremor of excitement in his hindquarters. It was the textbook response of a dog with professional training, not something you'd expect from a puppy, especially one that had apparently been abandoned. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, staring down at Sullivan. The puppy maintained his position, only his eyes moving to glance up at Marcus as if awaiting the next command. Curiosity piqued, Marcus tried another command. "Stay." He walked to his bedroom doorway, turned and waited. Sullivan remained perfectly still, watching him intently. "Release," Marcus said, using the less common term rather than the usual "come" to test his theory. Immediately, Sullivan trotted over to him, stopping precisely at his feet. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was no ordinary lost pet. Sullivan had received specialized training, military or police-level training, which made the tag around his neck even more perplexing. Who was Sergeant Sullivan, and why would a highly trained dog bearing his name be abandoned behind a surplus store? The questions multiplied as Marcus went through his morning routine. Sullivan followed him from room to room, always attentive, responding to commands he hadn't even been given deliberately. When Marcus dropped his toothbrush, the puppy retrieved it without prompting. When Marcus reached for his medication on the top shelf, Sullivan sat back, watching in a way that eerily mimicked how a service dog might monitor its handler for signs of distress. "You're really something else, aren't you?" Marcus said as he poured kibble into a bowl. Thankfully, the shelter kept emergency supplies for staff who occasionally fostered animals overnight. Sullivan waited patiently, not diving for the food, until Marcus gave a slight nod of permission. As the puppy ate, Marcus examined the military tag more carefully in the morning light. The phone number that had been disconnected, the reference to the 75th Ranger Regiment, the mysterious Sentinel promise. None of it added up to a coherent story. And yet, Sullivan's behavior suggested there was truth behind the military connection. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor. "At the shelter, euthanasia list review at 9, need final decisions." The message snapped him back to the harsh reality of shelter work. Today, decisions would be made about which animals had run out of time and options. Sullivan, as the newest arrival with unknown history and no clearly identified owner, would typically be among the first considered for the list, especially given the shelter's critical space issues. "Not happening," Marcus muttered, looking down at Sullivan, who had finished eating and now sat watching him with those disconcertingly knowing eyes. "Not until we figure out your story." He texted back, "Taking personal day, fostering new GSD. Puppy from last night to assess behavior, training level, potential service dog background." The response came quickly. "Approved. Send intake, nigh tune, so I can update system. One less on today's list is good news." Marcus felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. Sullivan had earned at least a temporary reprieve, though he knew it was merely postponing the inevitable decision. Without an identified owner or a rescue organization willing to take him, Sullivan's future remained precarious. "Come on," Marcus said, grabbing his keys and jacket. "We've got some detective work to do." Sullivan followed him to the truck, jumping into the passenger seat with practiced ease when Marcus opened the door. As they drove through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, Marcus found himself talking to the puppy as if he were a person, something he normally avoided with shelter animals. First stop, Pine Ridge Veterans Center, he explained, glancing at Sullivan, who sat perfectly upright, watching the road ahead. If anyone's going to recognize that tag or know about this Sentinel promise, it'll be the old-timers who hang out there. The Veterans Center occupied a modest brick building that had once been a post office. Despite the early hour, several cars already filled the small parking lot, mostly belonging to the World War II and Vietnam veterans who gathered each morning for coffee and companionship before the center's official programs began. As Marcus helped Sullivan out of the truck, he noticed the puppy's demeanor change subtly. His ears moved continuously, scanning the environment, and his posture became more alert, more vigilant. It was the behavior of a working dog entering an unfamiliar situation, assessing potential threats, identifying exits, establishing situational awareness. "Easy," Marcus murmured, not entirely sure why he felt the need to reassure a dog who showed no signs of anxiety, merely professional focus. Sullivan glanced up at him briefly before returning to his scan of the surroundings. Inside, the center smelled of coffee and the industrial cleaner used on the worn linoleum floors. A group of 7 or 8 veterans of various ages sat around a collection of mismatched tables pushed together in the common area. Coffee cups and half-eaten donuts scattered between them. Frank Delaney, a Vietnam veteran who had helped Marcus navigate his own difficult transition to civilian life years ago, spotted them first. His weathered face broke into a smile as he waved them over. "Reed, haven't seen your ugly mug in weeks," Frank called out, his gravelly voice carrying across the room. "And who's your handsome friend?" The conversation in the room paused as all eyes turned to Marcus and Sullivan. The puppy remained perfectly composed despite the attention, staying precisely at Marcus's left heel without being commanded to do so. "This is Sullivan," Marcus replied, moving toward the group. "Found him last night trying to figure out where he belongs." As they approached the table, something unexpected happened. Sullivan's tail, which had been held in a neutral position, began to wag slowly. His eyes locked onto an empty chair at the far end of the table, and for a moment, the disciplined demeanor faltered. A small whine escaped him. The first vocalization Marcus had heard since finding him at the shelter. The veterans exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that Marcus couldn't interpret. "That's Jake's chair," said Roy Wilkins, a Desert Storm veteran who rarely spoke at these gatherings. "Dog seems to know it." Marcus frowned, confused. "Jake." "Jake Sullivan," Frank explained, his expression guarded as he studied the puppy more carefully. "Army Ranger. Used to come here sometimes before he was deployed again. Haven't seen him in, 2 years now?" "Sullivan," Marcus repeated, the name sending a jolt through him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cleaned tag he'd removed from the puppy's worn collar. This was around his neck when he was found. "Does this mean anything to you guys?" He placed the tag on the table, and the reaction was immediate. Several of the men leaned forward, their expressions shifting from casual interest to intense focus. Frank picked up the tag, turning it over in his fingers with the careful reverence of someone handling a fallen comrade's possessions. "Where exactly did you find this dog?" Frank asked, his voice now stripped of its earlier warmth. "I didn't personally find him," Marcus clarified. "Animal Control picked him up behind the old surplus store on Cypress. He was tied to a fence, abandoned." Frank and Roy exchanged another meaningful look. The atmosphere in the room had changed, becoming charged with an unspoken tension that Marcus couldn't decipher but could certainly feel. "That store's been closed for almost a year," Roy noted, "but it used to be Jake's favorite place. He helped the owner source authentic gear sometimes." Frank handed the tag to Roy, who examined it closely before passing it to another veteran at the table. The tag made its way around the circle, each man studying it with the same solemn attention. "And this Sentinel promise?" Marcus prompted, when no one volunteered additional information. Any idea what that means? The silence that followed his question felt deliberate rather than uncertain. These men knew something they weren't sharing, something connected to Jake Sullivan and by extension to the puppy that now sat patiently at Marcus's feet. Finally, Frank sighed, running a hand over his gray crew cut. It's not our story to tell, Reed. Not fully, anyway. He glanced down at Sullivan, whose eyes hadn't left the empty chair since they'd arrived. But I can tell you Jake was part of a special operations unit. Those boys made promises to each other that went beyond the usual brotherhood. Was? Marcus caught the past tense immediately. Jake Sullivan is dead? Another uncomfortable silence. He filled the room. It was Roy who finally answered, his voice low and controlled. According to the official record, yes, KIA 2 years ago, in an operation that's still largely classified. But you don't sound convinced, Marcus observed, noting the careful phrasing. Roy shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed volumes without committing to anything specific. Let's just say there were inconsistencies in the information some of us received, and questions that never got satisfactory answers. Marcus felt Sullivan press slightly against his leg, a subtle movement that nonetheless conveyed something, like anxiety or urgency. Looking down, he saw the puppy was now staring directly at him, rather than at the empty chair, those amber eyes seeming to plead for understanding. This dog is too young to have belonged to someone who died 2 years ago, Marcus pointed out. He can't be more than 5 or 6 months old. Frank nodded slowly. That's one of those inconsistencies we mentioned. He hesitated, then added, Jake had a dog with him on his last deployment, a German shepherd named Sentinel. According to the official report, both Jake and Sentinel were killed in action. The implications hung in the air, unspoken but obvious. If both the handler and his dog had died 2 years ago, how could this puppy exist? And why would it bear a tag with Sullivan's name and a reference to something called the Sentinel Promise? Look, Frank said, standing up and moving around the table to where Marcus stood. There's someone you should talk to. Jake's sister, Madeline. She never accepted the official story about her brother's death. Kept digging until the military basically told her to stop asking questions. If anyone might understand what this puppy means, it's her. Frank scribbled an address on a napkin and handed it to Marcus. She lives out by Weber Creek, about 30 minutes from here. Keeps to herself mostly, but if you mention my name, she'll talk to you. Marcus pocketed the address, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. This had started as a simple case of a lost pet, but was rapidly evolving into something much more complex and potentially dangerous. Thank you, he said, glancing around at the veterans who watched him with expressions that mixed concern with something that looked remarkably like hope. I'll let you know what I find out. As Marcus turned to leave, Sullivan still perfectly positioned at his heel, Frank placed a hand on his shoulder. Be careful, Reed. If this puppy is what I think it might be, a message from a man who officially doesn't exist anymore, then asking questions could attract attention you don't want. The warning sent a chill down Marcus's spine, awakening combat. Instincts he thought he'd left behind years ago. He nodded once, acknowledging both the warning and the unspoken suggestion that he might want to reconsider getting involved. But as they walked back to his truck, Sullivan's steady presence beside him, Marcus knew he'd already crossed a line. Whether out of compassion for the puppy, curiosity about the mystery, or some deeper connection to a fellow veteran he'd never met, he couldn't simply walk away now. Let's go find Madeline Sullivan, he told the puppy as they climbed back into the truck. Maybe she can tell us who you really are and why someone wanted you to be found. The gravel road leading to Madeline Sullivan's property wound through dense pine forest, each curve revealing less civilization and more wilderness. Marcus checked the address Frank had given him against his GPS, which insisted he was headed in the right direction, despite the increasingly remote surroundings. Sullivan sat in the passenger seat, his attention divided between the road ahead and the dense woods that occasionally pressed close enough to brush against the truck's side mirrors. "Not exactly a social butterfly, is she?" Marcus muttered as they passed a weathered no trespassing sign riddled with bullet holes. Sullivan's ears twitched at his voice, but the puppy remained focused on their surroundings with a vigilance that seemed at odds with his young age. The road finally opened into a clearing where a modest cabin stood, smoke curling from its stone chimney despite the mild spring temperature. A battered Jeep was parked beside a detached garage, whose doors hung slightly askew, giving the entire property an air of benign neglect. Nothing about the scene suggested military precision or connection, which, Marcus reflected, might be exactly the point. As he put the truck in park, Sullivan's demeanor changed. The puppy's ears went fully erect, his body tensing with recognition or anticipation. Marcus couldn't tell which. A small whine escaped him, only the second vocalization Marcus had heard since finding him. "You know this place, don't you?" Marcus asked quietly. Sullivan responded by pawing at the window, his discipline momentarily forgotten in what appeared to be eagerness to exit the vehicle. Before Marcus could open his door, movement caught his eye. A woman had emerged from the cabin, a shotgun held casually but competently in her hands. She didn't point it directly at the truck, but her message was clear. Strangers weren't welcome without good reason. "That's far enough," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "State your business or turn around." Marcus raised his hand slightly in the universal gesture of peaceful intentions. "Madeline Sullivan," he called back. "Frank, Delaney from the Veterans Center sent me. I need to talk to you about your brother." The mention of her brother's name had an immediate effect. The woman's posture stiffened, the shotgun rising slightly before she visibly forced herself to lower it. "Who are you?" she demanded, making no move to approach the truck. "My name is Marcus Reed. I work at Pinewood Animal Shelter, and I found someone you might want to see." As if on cue, Sullivan barked once, sharp and authoritative, a sound that startled Marcus with its mature resonance. It wasn't the high-pitched yap of a puppy, but the controlled vocalization of a working dog trying to communicate. Madeline Sullivan went perfectly still. From this distance, Marcus couldn't read her expression, but he could see that her attention had shifted entirely to the passenger window, where Sullivan now stood with his paws on the dashboard, tail swinging in broad arcs. "Bring him out," she said finally. Her voice changed in a way Marcus couldn't quite identify. "Slowly." Marcus complied, opening the passenger door carefully and helping Sullivan to the ground. The moment the puppy's paws touched the gravel, his training reasserted itself. He positioned himself precisely at Marcus's left heel, alert but controlled, waiting for either a command or for Marcus to begin walking. Madeline watched this display with narrowed eyes, her knuckles white around the shotgun's stock. Without taking her gaze from Sullivan, she called out, "Have him sit, then you step away." Marcus glanced down at Sullivan, uncertain if the puppy would obey a command from him in this charged situation. But before he could speak, Sullivan sat perfectly, his amber eyes fixed on Madeline with a focus that seemed almost human in its intensity. Feeling strangely as though he was merely a bystander in a reunion between the puppy and this unknown woman, Marcus stepped several paces to the right. "His tag has your brother's name on it," he offered into the tense silence. "It mentions something called the Sentinel Promise." At these words, Madeline's composure finally broke. The shotgun lowered completely, its butt resting on the ground. As she leaned on it for support, her free hand covered her mouth, and even from this distance, Marcus could see she was trembling. "Atlas," she whispered, the name barely audible across the clearing. "Come." Sullivan, or Atlas as she had called him, remained perfectly still for 3 heartbeats, his training warring with recognition. Then, with a joyful bark that dispelled any remaining doubt, he raced across the clearing and launched himself at Madeline, who knelt to receive him with open arms, the shotgun forgotten in the dirt beside her. The transformation was immediate and complete. The disciplined, almost stoic puppy Marcus had known for less than 24 hours became a wriggling mass of fur and enthusiasm, licking Madeline's face and whining with such naked emotion that Marcus felt like an intruder witnessing something deeply private. After several minutes of this reunion, Madeline seemed to remember his presence. She stood, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand, the puppy now pressed firmly against her legs as if afraid she might vanish. "You better come inside," she said, her voice rough with emotion but no longer hostile. "There's a lot to explain, and I've learned the hard way that some conversations shouldn't happen in the open." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly modern compared to its rustic exterior. Clean lines, minimal decoration, and state-of-the-art. Technology suggested a mind that valued function over form. The only personal touches were photographs, dozens of them, covering one entire wall. From his position near the door, Marcus could see they primarily featured a man in military uniform, often with a large German shepherd at his side. "That's Jake," Madeline said, following his gaze as she set 2 mugs of coffee on the small dining table. "My brother, and that's the original Sentinel, his military working dog." Marcus accepted the offered coffee with murmured thanks, his attention caught by the resemblance between the German shepherd in the photos and the puppy, Atlas, who now lay at Madeline's feet, unwilling to be more than inches from her. "Atlas looks just like him," Marcus observed. Madeline nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. "He should. He's Sentinel's son, from his last litter before—" She trailed off, taking a sip of coffee instead of finishing the thought. Marcus waited, sensing that pushing for information would only make Madeline retreat. His patience was rewarded when she set down her mug with a decisive clink and fixed him with a penetrating stare. "How exactly did you find him?" she asked. "And I want every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Marcus recounted the events of the previous evening. Carlos bringing the puppy to the shelter, discovering the tag, taking Atlas home rather than leaving him at the overcrowded facility. He described the puppy's trained behaviors, his visit to the Veterans Center, and Frank's recommendation to seek her out. Madeline listened without interruption, occasionally reaching down to stroke Atlas's head when certain details caused the puppy to whine or shift restlessly. Only when Marcus had finished did she speak again. 2 years ago, my brother was reported killed in action during a classified operation. According to the official report, his entire unit was ambushed, no survivors, including Sentinel. Her voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened around her mug. I was given a flag, offered condolences, and told the details would always remain classified for national security reasons. She stood abruptly, moving to a bookshelf where she retrieved a worn manila folder. But there were inconsistencies from the beginning. The dates didn't align with Jake's last communication to me. The personal effects they returned included items I knew Jake had given away months before, and most significantly, she pulled a photograph from the folder and handed it to Marcus. This arrived 3 months after his supposed death. The photo showed a desert sunset, remarkable only for the distinctive rock formation silhouetted against the fading light. No people, no message, no identifying information of any kind. Just a landscape at dusk. "I don't understand," Marcus admitted, studying the image for hidden clues. That formation is called Chimney Rock. It's in a remote region of a country Jake had been deployed to. This exact view was from a position he and I had talked about, a place he called his thinking spot. During his first tour there, Madeline tapped the photo with one finger. The significance is in the timing. This photo was taken and sent after his reported death, No postmark, no return address, but it found its way to my mailbox. The implications made Marcus's mouth go dry. "You think he's still alive?" It wasn't a question, but Madeline answered anyway. "I know he is, or at least he was when that photo was sent. And now this..." She gestured to Atlas, who watched their exchange with those intelligent eyes. "Further confirms it." "How?" Marcus asked. "The puppy can't be more than 6 months old." 5 months and 12 days, Madeline corrected. "I know because Sentinel's last litter was born 1 week before Jake's unit was deployed on that final mission. Jake helped deliver the puppies himself at the training facility. He sent me pictures." She returned to the bookshelf and extracted a small leather journal from between 2 larger books. "Jake and I developed our own code when we were kids. We've used it to communicate when he was deployed in situations where his communications might be monitored." Opening the journal, she showed Marcus pages filled with what appeared to be normal entries about everyday life, interspersed with passages that contained highlighted words. "The last coded message I received from Jake, 1 week before his death, indicated he suspected someone in his unit was compromised. He didn't know who, but he was initiating something called Protocol Ghostwalker." Her finger traced a line of text where certain words had been subtly underlined. "He mentioned the puppies specifically, saying if anything happened to him, I should expect the smallest sentinel to bring the biggest truth." Marcus glanced down at Atlas, who had not moved from Madeline's feet. "So Atlas is the message, but what's the truth he's supposed to bring?" Madeline's expression hardened. "That's what I've been trying to figure out since he arrived on my doorstep with you. The tag is significant. Jake and his unit created those for each other. A promise that if one fell, the others would ensure." Their story was told truthfully, not buried in redacted files and classified reports. She knelt beside Atlas, running her hands carefully through his fur. "There has to be more. Jake wouldn't send Atlas just as proof of life. There's information here, something important enough to risk exposing the fact that he survived whatever happened to his unit." Marcus watched as her fingers moved methodically through the puppy's coat, checking for hidden messages or devices. "Could it be microchipped somewhere unusual?" he suggested, "or wearing a secondary collar under the fur?" "Already checked for standard hiding places," Madeline responded without looking up. "Jake would have been more creative, especially if he suspected his communications were being monitored." As she continued her examination, Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. His own military experience had been straightforward. No covert operations, no coded messages. But he'd heard stories from other veterans about ingenious methods of smuggling information past enemy lines. "What about his behavior?" Marcus suggested. "Atlas responds to specific commands in ways that seem almost like a code themselves. At the Veterans Center, he fixated on your brother's empty chair, as if he recognized it somehow." Madeline paused, considering this. "Jake trained all of Sentinel's puppies from birth, using specialized protocols. They're bred for intelligence and specific behavioral traits." She looked at Atlas thoughtfully. "Commands might be a trigger for revealing information." She straightened up, her expression newly determined. "Atlas, attention," she commanded in a tone Marcus hadn't heard her use before. The effect on the puppy was electric. He immediately stood at perfect attention, his posture shifting from relaxed pet to working dog in an instant. "Sentinel protocol, initiate," Madeline continued, her voice firm and clear. Atlas tilted his head slightly, ears fully erect, then walked deliberately to the cabin door. He scratched once, then looked back at Madeline expectantly. "He wants us to follow him," she said, already reaching for her jacket. Marcus stood, uncertainty warring with curiosity. "Follow him where?" Madeline checked a handgun that Marcus hadn't noticed was holstered at the small of her back, then grabbed the shotgun from where it leaned against the wall. "I don't know. But if Jake programmed this behavior into him, it's important." She handed Marcus the shotgun, which he accepted automatically. You should be armed. If my suspicions about what happened to Jake's unit are correct, we may not be the only ones looking for whatever Atlas is about to show us. The casual way she mentioned potential danger sent a chill down Marcus's spine, awakening combat instincts he'd tried to leave behind when he left the military. Maybe we should contact Frank, let someone know what we're doing. Madeline shook her head firmly. No communications, not until we understand what we're dealing with. Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. You can stay here if you want. This isn't your fight. Marcus looked down at Atlas, who watched him with those knowing amber eyes. In less than a day, this puppy had upended his carefully structured life, drawing him into a mystery that apparently involved covert operations, fake deaths, and potential danger from unknown threats. The logical choice was clear. Stay out of it. Return to the shelter. Forget he ever saw the military tag around a stray puppy's neck. Yet even as these thoughts formed, Marcus knew he couldn't walk away. Whether from his own military background, his instinctive connection to Atlas, or simply basic human curiosity, he was already committed to seeing this through. Lead the way, he told Atlas, who responded with what Marcus could have sworn was an approving look before turning and trotting out the door with purposeful steps. As they followed the puppy into the surrounding forest, Madeline fell into step beside Marcus. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jake always said you could tell a person's character by how they respond to the unexpected. Marcus adjusted his grip on the shotgun, scanning the trees ahead from habit. "I haven't done anything yet." "You saved Atlas," Madeline corrected him, when it would have been easier to process him as just another stray. She glanced sideways at him, her expression softening briefly. "Whatever happens next, that matters." Atlas led them along a barely visible trail that wound deeper into the pine forest surrounding Madeline's property. He moved with confidence, occasionally pausing to ensure they were following, but never deviating from what was clearly a predetermined route. "He knows exactly where he's going," Marcus observed as they crossed a small stream using stepping stones that would have been invisible without the puppy's guidance. Madeline nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. Jake must have brought him this way multiple times, imprinting the route. It's a training technique used with special operations dogs. They can memorize complex paths after just a few repetitions. The implications made Marcus uneasy. "So your brother was here, with Atlas, relatively recently, within the puppy's lifetime?" "Yes," Madeline confirmed, "which means whatever he's hiding, whatever truth he wanted me to find, it's been here all along, waiting for the right moment or the right messenger to reveal it." They continued in silence, the forest growing denser around them. Marcus found himself automatically falling into patrol formation, scanning sectors, maintaining situational awareness, moving with measured steps to minimize noise. Beside him, Madeline moved with similar precision, her own military training evident in her posture and alertness. Atlas suddenly stopped, his tail straight out behind him in the pointing position that working dogs use to indicate something of significance. Ahead, barely visible among the underbrush, was what appeared to be a natural rock formation. But as they drew closer, Marcus realized it was man-made. A carefully constructed hiding place designed to blend perfectly with the surrounding environment. Only someone who knew exactly what to look for would ever find it. "Military cache," Madeline whispered, kneeling beside Atlas, who now sat perfectly still, his job completed. "Standard special operations technique for establishing emergency resources or communication drops." With experienced hands, she located the hidden latch and swung open a section of the rock to reveal a waterproof case nestled inside. The case was secured with a combination lock, which gave Madeline only a moment's pause before she entered a sequence of numbers. "Jake's and my birthdays, backwards," she explained as the lock clicked open. "Our childhood code." Inside the case lay a sealed waterproof pouch, a loaded handgun with suppressor, a satellite phone unlike any civilian model Marcus had seen, and a small medical kit. Madeline ignored everything except the pouch, which she opened with careful movements. From inside, she extracted a thumb drive and a handwritten letter in a sealed plastic bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she recognized her brother's handwriting, but her voice remained steady as she read aloud. "Maddie, if you're reading this, Atlas completed his mission. Everything you need is on the drive. Proof of what really happened, who was responsible, and why. Trust no one except the person who helped Atlas find you. They've already proven their character by saving him when others would have seen just another stray. The Sentinel promise doesn't end until the truth is known. Stay safe. I'm closer than you think. Jay." Marcus and Madeline looked at each other, the weight of Jake Sullivan's words settling between them like a physical presence. Atlas, his mission complete, pressed against Madeline's leg, his disciplined demeanor finally giving way to the simple, comfort-seeking behavior of a puppy who had carried a heavy burden. The return journey through the forest took half the time of their outward trek. Atlas led them along a different route, one that avoided open areas and provided better cover. Marcus noted this tactical choice with growing unease. The puppy wasn't simply leading them home. He was leading them home safely, as if anticipating potential surveillance or danger. "He's been trained for evasive movement," Marcus observed quietly as they ducked under a low-hanging pine branch. "That's not standard, even for military dogs." Madeline nodded, her expression grim. Jake's unit specialized in infiltration and extraction. Their dogs were trained accordingly. She glanced down at Atlas, who moved with fluid purpose, occasionally stopping to listen before proceeding. "Though I've never seen training this advanced in a puppy so young." When they finally emerged from the tree line behind Madeline's cabin, both humans instinctively paused to scan the clearing before proceeding. Nothing appeared disturbed, but Marcus noticed Madeline didn't relax her vigilance as they approached the back door. "Wait here," she instructed, handing him the case before slipping inside alone. After a tense minute, she reappeared and beckoned him in. "Clear, but we shouldn't stay long." Inside, Madeline moved with practiced efficiency, gathering essential items into a weathered backpack. She paused only briefly to connect the thumb drive to a laptop that she produced from a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard. "We need to see what's on this before we go anywhere," she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "It might determine where we need to head next." Marcus set the shotgun aside and knelt to check on Atlas, who had stationed himself near the front window, his attention focused outside. The puppy's alertness further confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion that whatever situation they had stumbled into was far more dangerous than a simple case of a missing soldier. "There's a whole series of files here," Madeline called from the laptop. "Videos, documents, photographs." Her voice trailed off as she opened the first video file. The screen displayed a timestamp from 18 months ago and showed a man Marcus recognized from the photographs as Jake Sullivan. He was thinner than in the photos, with a healing scar across his left cheek, but his eyes held the same intense focus Marcus had observed in Atlas. "Maddie, if you're watching this, then Atlas completed his mission," Jake began, his voice low and steady. "I don't have much time, so I'll get straight to the point. The operation that supposedly killed my entire unit was a setup. We were sent to intercept what we were told was a high-value terrorist courier, but what we found instead was evidence of American weapons being funneled to insurgent groups, weapons authorized by people high up our own chain of command." Jake glanced over his shoulder as if checking that he was still alone, then continued. 5 of us survived the initial ambush. When we realized what was happening, we made a decision to disappear rather than report back. Returning would have meant immediate elimination given what we'd discovered. They needed a clean slate, which meant everyone involved had to be reported dead. Marcus moved to stand behind Madeline, watching as Jake detailed names, dates, and coordinates, methodically building a case of weapons trafficking, falsified intelligence, and deliberate sacrifice of American soldiers to protect a lucrative side operation. Everything's documented on this drive, Jake continued. Enough evidence to bring down 3 generals and at least 1 high-ranking official at the Department of Defense. But getting this information to the right people has proven nearly impossible. Every channel we've tried has been compromised. The video cut briefly as Jake moved to a different position. When it resumed, his expression was even more grave. 2 of our group have been found and eliminated in the past 6 months. We're running out of options and time. That's why I've trained Atlas for this contingency. The puppy is our last secure messenger. Jake's face softened slightly. I'm sorry to place this burden on you, Maddie, but you're the only person left I trust completely. Use the satellite phone in the cache to contact the number stored in its memory. Mention the Sentinel promise, and they'll arrange a secure meeting. As the video ended, Madeline sat perfectly still, her hands flat on the table beside the laptop. The only indication of her emotional state was a slight tremor in her shoulders. I need a minute, she said, her voice carefully controlled. There are more files to review. Marcus nodded, giving her space as she opened document after document, occasionally making notes on a small pad beside her. Atlas had left his post by the window and now sat at Madeline's feet, his amber eyes watching her with what looked remarkably like concern. The silence was broken by the distinct crunch of tires on gravel outside. Madeline's head snapped up, her hand automatically reaching for her weapon. Were you followed? She asked sharply, already moving to shut down the laptop. No, Marcus replied with certainty. He'd spent the entire drive to her cabin checking for tails, an old habit from his military days that had apparently never fully left him. At least, not by vehicle. Madeline moved to the window, carefully positioning herself to see without being seen. Her entire demeanor changed instantly. Black SUV, government plates, 2 men in suits, but their posture screams military. She turned to Marcus, her expression hardening. This is not a coincidence. Marcus's mind raced through options. Could they have tracked the puppy somehow? A chip or... No time to speculate. Madeline cut him off, already gathering the laptop and the most essential items from her partially packed bag. We need to go now. There's a maintenance access to the storm cellar from the pantry. It connects to an old mining tunnel that runs beneath the property. She whistled softly, and Atlas was instantly at attention, all puppy playfulness gone from his bearing. Atlas, shadow protocol, she commanded. The German shepherd moved immediately to a position behind her, practically invisible in her shadow, a technique designed to make the dog appear to be an extension of his handler rather than a separate entity. Marcus grabbed the shotgun and his jacket, pausing only to peer quickly through the window. The 2 men had split up, one approaching the front door while the other circled toward the back of the cabin. Their movements were coordinated and practiced, definitely not local law enforcement or casual visitors. These aren't random government officials, he said, ducking away from the window. They're moving like tactical units. Madeline had already opened a concealed door in the back of her pantry, revealing a narrow passage downward. Jake and I prepared this place years ago, she explained, ushering Atlas into the darkness ahead of her. Paranoia runs in the family, apparently. Marcus followed them into the passage, pulling the hidden door closed behind them just as a heavy knock sounded at the cabin's front entrance. The narrow stairs led to a small cellar with rough-hewn walls and a low ceiling. A single battery-powered lantern provided minimal illumination, revealing a tunnel mouth on the far side, partially concealed by shelving. That tunnel comes out half a mile away, near the creek bed, Madeline explained, already moving the shelving unit aside. There's a hunting blind we can use for temporary cover while we figure out our next move. Above them, the muffled sound of the cabin door being forced open reached their ears. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor overhead, accompanied by terse, professional commands that confirmed these were not ordinary intruders. "Sweep for hidden compartments and access points," a voice directed. Subject Sullivan may have installed evasion routes. Marcus and Madeline exchanged glances in the dim light. The specificity of the order confirmed their worst fears. These men were looking for precisely what they were using to escape. "This isn't some opportunistic follow-up on Atlas being found," Madeline whispered. "They were monitoring my property already." As if in confirmation, another voice above them reported, "Fresh tire tracks in the drive. Sullivan has had visitors recently. Check the woods for signs of movement." "We need to move," Marcus urged, already guiding Atlas into the tunnel mouth. "They'll find this entrance soon enough." The tunnel was narrow and damp, requiring them to proceed in single file, with Marcus leading, Atlas in the middle, and Madeline bringing up the rear with the lantern. The earthen passage showed signs of recent maintenance. Supporting timbers were new, and the floor had been leveled to allow for swift, quiet movement. "Jake must have been working on this recently," Marcus observed, noting tool marks that couldn't be more than a few months old. "He's been preparing for something," Madeline agreed, her voice tight with controlled tension. "The question is, what exactly did he think was coming?" They moved as quickly as possible while maintaining silence, aware that sound could potentially travel through the ground above them. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the tunnel began to slope upward, eventually terminating at a ladder that led to a trapdoor concealed beneath forest debris. Marcus climbed first, carefully pushing the trapdoor open just enough to scan their surroundings. The exit emerged in a dense thicket approximately half a mile from the cabin, with a clear view of the creek below. No signs of pursuit were visible, but he remained vigilant as he helped Atlas and then Madeline up through the opening. Once they were all clear, Madeline sealed the trapdoor and carefully arranged fallen branches and leaves to conceal any sign of their passage. Atlas remained perfectly silent throughout this process, his training evidently including stealth operations, another unusual capability for a puppy so young. "The hunting blind is this way," Madeline whispered, pointing toward a dense stand of pines that bordered the creek. "We'll have cover and sight lines in both directions." As they moved through the underbrush, Marcus found himself automatically falling into a security pattern, checking their rear, scanning for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong in the forest. It had been years since he'd needed these skills, but they returned with disturbing ease, as if they'd been waiting just beneath the surface of his civilian life. The hunting blind proved to be more sophisticated than Marcus had expected. Constructed to resemble a natural rock outcropping near the creek bank, it offered excellent concealment while providing clear views of the surrounding area. Inside was a small cache of supplies: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and another loaded handgun, which Madeline immediately checked and secured. "Jake thinks of everything," Marcus observed, impressed despite the circumstances. "He always has," Madeline replied, her expression softening momentarily before hardening again with resolve. "Which is why I've never believed he was dead. Jake wouldn't go down without leaving me a way to find the truth." She removed the satellite phone from her backpack and powered it on. "There's only one number programmed into this," she explained, keeping her voice low. "According to Jake's video, it's our secure contact, someone who can help get this evidence to the right people." Marcus positioned himself at the observation slit in the blind's wall, keeping watch while Madeline made the call. Atlas settled beside him, his attention similarly focused outward, both of them scanning for any sign of their pursuers. "This is Madeline Sullivan," she said into the phone, her voice steady and controlled. "I'm calling regarding the Sentinel promise." There was a pause as she listened to the response, her expression giving nothing away. "Yes, I have it. All of it." Another pause. 2 hours isn't possible. We've got company of the unwelcome variety." She listened again, more intently. "Understood. We'll be there." She ended the call and tucked the phone away. "Our contact can meet us in River Point, about 30 miles from here. There's a 24-hour diner called the Blue Plate. We're to sit in the last booth by the emergency exit and order coffee with apple pie. They'll find us." River Point is a good choice, Marcus noted. Big enough to blend in, small enough to spot surveillance easily. He glanced at Atlas. "But we have one problem. A German Shepherd puppy is fairly memorable. If these people are searching for us, he'll make us easy to identify." Madeline nodded, already thinking through solutions. "There's a change of clothes for me in this cache, but nothing for you or Atlas." She considered for a moment. "There's a ranger station about 2 miles downstream. This time of year, it's only staffed during daylight hours. They might have something we can use." Marcus checked his watch. Almost noon. They'd have to move quickly to reach River Point by the designated meeting time. "What about transportation? My truck is still at your cabin, and it's probably being watched." "There's an ATV hidden about. A quarter mile from here," Madeline replied. "Jake and I used it for maintenance runs to the more remote parts of the property. It's not ideal, but it will get us to the main road where we can hopefully arrange alternate transportation." Atlas suddenly tensed, his ears swiveling toward the direction of the cabin. A moment later, Marcus heard it too, the distant sound of voices and movement through the forest. Their pursuers had discovered the tunnel. "They're tracking us," Marcus said grimly. "We need to move, now." They quickly gathered the essential supplies from the blind, leaving no trace of their presence. Madeline led them along the creek bed, using the water to mask their scent and footprints. Atlas moved with perfect discipline, staying close and making no sound despite the challenging terrain. The ranger station appeared after a grueling 20-minute hike through increasingly difficult forest. The small wooden building sat in a clearing, a forest service truck parked beside it. As Madeline had predicted, no one was present. The station closed until the following morning. "I need to get inside and find something to disguise Atlas," Madeline said, already examining the windows for the easiest access. "Keep watch." Marcus positioned himself with a clear view in all directions, the shotgun ready but concealed against his leg. Atlas sat beside him, his attention divided between their back trail and Madeline's activities. With practiced efficiency that raised several questions about her background, Madeline bypassed the station's simple lock and slipped inside. She emerged less than 5 minutes later with a canvas bag and a triumphant expression. "Ranger vest and hat for you," she said, tossing the items to Marcus. "And for our four-legged friend." She pulled out a bright orange vest with "Search, Dog in Training" printed on both sides. The perfect disguise. No one questions official-looking dogs with vests. The transformation was remarkable. With Marcus in the ranger hat and vest over his regular clothes, Madeline with her hair tucked up under a baseball cap, and Atlas sporting his official-looking training vest, they presented a completely different visual profile than the one their pursuers would be looking for. "The ATV is this way," Madeline said, gesturing toward a game trail that led away from the creek. "From there, we can reach the highway and figure out our next move." As they set off once more, Marcus found himself pondering the strange turns his life had taken in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, he had been a shelter worker facing another difficult day of life and death decisions for unwanted animals. Now he was fleeing from what appeared to be government operatives, carrying classified evidence of military corruption, with a specially trained German Shepherd puppy who had somehow become the key to unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of command. Atlas trotted beside him, the orange vest making him look like any search and rescue dog in training, rather than the remarkable messenger he truly was. Looking at the puppy's alert expression and purposeful movements, Marcus couldn't help but feel that Atlas had chosen him specifically, that their meeting at the shelter hadn't been random chance, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan. Your brother went to extraordinary lengths to protect this information, Marcus observed, as they hiked toward the hidden ATV. Training Atlas, setting up these safe routes and caches, preparing for multiple contingencies. He must have known exactly how dangerous his discovery was. Madeline nodded, her expression hardening. Jake always said that you could measure the importance of information by how desperately people wanted to keep it hidden. She glanced back toward the direction they had come, where distant shouts confirmed their pursuers were still searching. Based on today's response time, I'd say this: information is very important indeed. The hidden ATV turned out to be a rugged four-wheeler, concealed beneath a camouflaged tarp in a natural depression behind a fallen tree. It was dusty but well maintained, starting on the first attempt when Madeline turned the key she retrieved from a small magnetic case attached to the frame. "I'll drive," she said, settling into the seat. "Atlas can ride between us. Hold on tight. This isn't going to be a smooth journey." As they set off through the forest on the small vehicle, Marcus kept the shotgun ready across his lap, his attention continuously scanning their surroundings. Atlas balanced perfectly between them, his training evident in how he adjusted to the ATV's movements without losing his position. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded, but Marcus knew their advantage was temporary. Whoever was after them had resources and determination. The race to River Point and their mysterious contact had begun with Atlas, the puppy who had so nearly been just another statistic on the shelter's euthanasia list, now at the center of a mission with stakes higher than Marcus could have possibly imagined. The ATV bounced over a fallen log, sending a jarring impact through Marcus's spine as he gripped the frame with one hand and secured Atlas with the other. Madeline navigated the rough terrain with practiced skill, taking routes that seemed invisible until they were directly upon them. They had been traveling for nearly 40 minutes, zigzagging through the dense forest to avoid potential aerial surveillance while making steady progress toward the highway. "There's a gas station about a mile from where we'll hit the main road," Madeline called over her shoulder, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. "Old place run by a Vietnam vet named Miller. He might help us with transportation." Marcus nodded, though he doubted she could see the gesture. His mind was racing through their limited options. Even with their makeshift disguises, they would be conspicuous on foot, especially with Atlas. And while the puppy's training was remarkable, he was still physically a young dog. His endurance had limits they couldn't afford to test under these circumstances. The forest finally began to thin, revealing glimpses of open fields beyond the tree line. Madeline slowed the ATV, cutting the engine as they approached the edge of the woods. She gestured for silence, then dismounted and moved forward in a crouch to survey the area ahead. Marcus stayed with Atlas, one hand resting lightly on the puppy's back. Despite the tension of their situation, Atlas remained calm and focused, his amber eyes continuously scanning their surroundings. It was an eerie reminder that this was no ordinary dog. He had been specifically prepared for this mission, trained from birth to carry out complex tasks under dangerous conditions. Madeline returned a few minutes later, her expression tense but determined. "Highway's clear for now, but there's a patrol car parked at the crossroads, about half a mile east. Could be routine, could be looking for us. Either way, we can't risk the ATV on open roads," Marcus observed. "Too visible, too unusual." Agreed. Madeline checked her watch. "Miller's place is west of here. If we stick to the tree line for another quarter mile, we can approach from the rear of his property without being seen from the road." They pushed the ATV deeper into the forest, concealing it with branches and underbrush before continuing on foot. Atlas moved with fluid grace between them, his orange search dog in training vest, a splash of color against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. Miller's gas and service appeared as they crested a small rise, a weathered single-story building with 2 ancient pumps out front and a gravel lot containing 3 vehicles in various states of repair. A faded American flag hung limply from a pole near the entrance, and hand-painted signs advertised bait, cold drinks, and the best damn beef jerky in the county. They approached cautiously from behind, using a line of scraggly pines for cover until they reached an equipment shed at the rear of the property. Atlas suddenly tensed, his nose twitching as he caught a scent. Before either human could react, a gruff voice spoke from nearby. "You folks look like you're trying mighty hard not to be seen," an elderly man said, stepping around the corner of the shed with a shotgun held casually in his weathered hands. "That usually means trouble." Madeline froze, keeping her hands visible. "Mr. Miller, Frank Delaney from the Veteran Center said you might be willing to help a fellow vet." The man, presumably Miller, narrowed his eyes, studying them carefully. His gaze lingered on their ranger disguises, then settled on Atlas, who sat perfectly still, waiting for commands. "Frank sent you?" Miller's voice remained skeptical, but he lowered the shotgun slightly. "That dog's wearing a search vest, but he ain't no regular SAR trainee. Military working dog posture." He looked directly at Marcus. "You serve?" "3rd Infantry Division, Iraq," Marcus replied steadily. "2 tours," Miller nodded once, seeming to come to a decision. "Inside? Quick. Back door. Been too many strange vehicles passing through today for my liking." The interior of the gas station was surprisingly clean and organized, despite the weathered exterior. Miller led them through a storage area to a small office cluttered with paperwork, fishing trophies, and framed military photographs. He closed the door behind them, engaging multiple locks before turning to face his unexpected visitors. "Now, what kind of trouble has Frank gotten me into this time?" he asked, setting his shotgun carefully into a rack on the wall. Madeline glanced at Marcus, a silent question passing between them about how much to reveal. Marcus gave a slight nod. They needed allies, and Miller's quick recognition of Atlas's military training suggested he might be more valuable than just transportation. "We need to get to River Point," Madeline began. "Discreetly. There are people looking for us who would prefer we didn't make it there." Miller's weathered face remained impassive as he studied them. "Government types in black SUVs and suits that don't quite hide shoulder holsters." When Madeline's eyes widened slightly, he nodded. "3 of them stopped here about an hour ago. Asked if I'd seen anyone unusual passing through. Showed me badges that moved too quick to read properly." Marcus felt a chill settle in his stomach. Their pursuers were closing in faster than anticipated. "What did you tell them?" "Told them the truth," Miller replied with a shrug. "Haven't seen anyone unusual. Today," a ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Course, my definition of unusual might differ from theirs." He moved to a grimy window, peering through the blinds at the empty road beyond. "You military or ex-military?" he asked without turning around. "Both," Madeline answered. "My brother is 75th Ranger Regiment, currently classified status." Miller turned at that, his expression sharpening. "That explains the dog. Rangers have been working with specialized canine units for operations even the regular military doesn't know about." He nodded toward Atlas. "And that ain't no ordinary puppy, is he? Too focused, too disciplined." Atlas, seeming to recognize he was being discussed, straightened his posture slightly, but remained in his designated position beside Madeline. "He's carrying information that needs to reach the right people," Marcus said carefully. "Information that could explain why some very powerful individuals would prefer he'd been put down at the shelter yesterday instead of being noticed." Understanding dawned in Miller's eyes. Dead men tell no tales, and dead dogs deliver no messages. He walked to a metal cabinet in the corner of the office, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. You need to get to River Point without being spotted, and you need to get there fast. From the cabinet, he withdrew a set of keys and a folded map. I've got a delivery van out back. Used it for parts runs before my nephew took over that side of the business. It's not pretty, but it's reliable. More importantly, it's got a false compartment we used for running special cargo during hunting season. Special cargo? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Miller's face remained neutral. Venison doesn't always wait for official season to become available. The compartment's big enough for the three of you if you need to avoid checkpoints. Madeline took the keys Miller offered, genuine gratitude in her expression. We can't pay you right now, but Miller waved away her words. Keep your money. Frank vouched for you indirectly, and that's good enough. He looked down at Atlas, who returned, his gaze steadily. Besides, something tells me that whatever that dog is carrying is worth more than money. He spread the map on his cluttered desk, pointing to a winding line he'd marked in faded highlighter. Take these back roads. They add about 20 minutes to the journey, but they'll keep you off the main highways where they're likely watching. There's a service entrance behind the blue plate. Delivery vehicles use it all day, so you won't stand out. Marcus studied the route, memorizing the key turns and landmarks. They'll have your place under surveillance now that they've visited once. How do we leave without being seen? Miller's weathered face broke into a genuine smile for the first time. Next fuel delivery is due in about 5 minutes. Big tanker pulls right up to block the view from the road. Driver's my cousin's boy. He'll understand if the delivery takes a bit longer than usual today, with all the paperwork and such. As if on cue, the rumble of a large diesel engine became audible, growing louder as it approached the station. Miller nodded in satisfaction. Right on time. You folks get ready to move, and I'll make sure the coast is clear. While Miller went to direct the incoming fuel truck, Marcus and Madeline quickly reviewed their plan. The Blue Plate Diner was their rendezvous point with Jake's mysterious contact, but they still had no idea who they were meeting or how they would be recognized beyond the simple code of coffee and apple pie. We'll need to be extremely cautious, Madeline said, checking the handgun she kept holstered at her back. If these people found us at my cabin so quickly, they might have the diner under surveillance too. Marcus nodded grimly. We should have a contingency plan. If anything seems off when we arrive, we abort immediately, Madeline finished for him. The information is too important to risk in an ambush. Atlas had been sitting quietly in their discussion, but now he stood, ears fully alert, eyes fixed on the door Miller had exited through. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest. Both humans instantly went silent, hands moving to their weapons. Marcus crept to the window, carefully peering through a narrow gap in the blinds. What he saw made his blood run cold. A black SUV had pulled up beside the fuel truck, and two men in suits were speaking with Miller, who gestured animatedly toward the highway, pointing east. The men seemed to be buying his story. But a third agent had exited the vehicle and was scanning the property with the methodical precision of someone with tactical training. We've got company, Marcus whispered, moving away from the window. Miller's buying us time, but we need to move now. Madeline was already gathering their few belongings. The van, around back, according to Miller. We'll have to circle behind the shed we passed on our way in. They slipped out through a rear door, keeping the main building between themselves and the front, where Miller continued his animated conversation with the agents. Atlas moved silently between them, his training evident in every measured step and alert movement. The delivery van was exactly where Miller had indicated, a battered white vehicle with Miller's Gas and Service painted on the side in faded letters. Rust had claimed the lower panels, and one headlight was held in place with what appeared to be duct tape, but the engine started on the first try when Madeline inserted the key. Marcus quickly secured Atlas in the back, then joined Madeline in the front seat. False compartment? She nodded, pointing to what looked like a tool storage area along one side of the cargo space. Lever on the underside releases the panel. We'll use it if we have to, but let's hope Miller's distraction works. They waited tensely as Miller's conversation with the agents continued. Through the side mirror, Marcus could see the third agent completing his circuit of the building, approaching dangerously close to their position. "We can't wait any longer," Madeline whispered. "We'll have to risk it." She put the van in gear and eased around the side of the building, keeping their speed deliberately unhurried, despite the urgency they both felt. As they approached the driveway that would take them to the road, the fuel truck driver, apparently understanding the situation, repositioned his massive vehicle to block the agent's view. They slipped onto the road, maintaining a casual pace, until they were around the first bend. Only then did Madeline accelerate, quickly putting distance between themselves and the gas station. "That was too close," Marcus exhaled, checking the side mirrors for any sign of pursuit. "They're casting a wider net than I expected. Jake's information must be even more damaging than we realized," Madeline replied, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "These aren't local police or even standard federal agents. Their response time and coordination suggest a specialized team with significant resources." In the back, Atlas had settled into a vigilant rest position, his amber eyes fixed on the rear window of the van. His disciplined calmness was reassuring, but Marcus couldn't help wondering what other capabilities the remarkable puppy might possess. The level of training he had demonstrated far exceeded anything Marcus had seen in military working dogs, let alone in an animal so young. They followed Miller's suggested route, winding through back roads that passed farms and small woodlots. The landscape gradually changed from rural farmland to more developed areas as they approached River Point. Traffic increased, providing welcome cover, but also raising the risk of being spotted. "We've got about 20 minutes until the meeting time," Madeline noted, checking her watch. "We should do a drive-by first. Look for anything suspicious." Marcus agreed, his military training reasserting itself as they entered the small city's outskirts. Watch for vehicles with multiple occupants, especially anyone who seems to be paying too much attention to the diner. Government types tend to stand out in places like this. They try too hard to look casual. The Blue Plate Diner sat on a corner near the city center, a classic stainless steel structure with large windows and a neon sign that had seen better days. They drove past once, then circled the block to approach from another angle, both of them scanning for signs of surveillance or ambush. "Parking lot looks normal," Marcus observed. "Mix of vehicles, nothing that screams government or military." Madeline nodded, but her expression remained tense. "The service entrance Miller mentioned is around back. We'll park there among the delivery vehicles and enter through the kitchen if possible." They pulled into the narrow alley behind the diner, finding a spot between a bread delivery truck and a restaurant supply van. The position offered good cover and a clear escape route if needed. "Atlas will need to stay hidden," Marcus said, eyeing the puppy who sat alertly in the cargo area. "A German Shepherd puppy is too memorable if anyone is looking for us." Madeline reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded blanket she had taken from the hunting blind. "We can use this to carry him in. I'll bundle him up like he's sleeping. Most people won't look twice at a covered pet as long as we move confidently." Atlas, seeming to understand his role, allowed himself to be wrapped in the blanket with only his nose exposed for breathing. Marcus gathered the bundle, surprised at how perfectly still the puppy remained, making the illusion of a sleeping dog completely convincing. "Ready?" Madeline asked, checking her weapon one last time before concealing it at the small of her back. Marcus nodded, adjusting his grip on Atlas's wrapped form. "As ready as we'll ever be." They entered through the service door, nodding confidently to a surprised kitchen worker who seemed about to question their presence. Madeline flashed a dazzling smile. "Sorry to cut through. Our little guy got car sick, and we need to get him to the bathroom quickly." The lie worked, earning them a sympathetic nod as they moved through the busy kitchen to the swinging doors that led into the diner proper. The noise and steam provided perfect cover, ensuring nobody paid too much attention to the bundled puppy in Marcus's arms. The diner was about half full, with the expected mix of locals and travelers typical of a roadside establishment. Marcus scanned the room casually as they moved toward the last booth by the emergency exit, noting positions, postures, and potential threats from habit. Nothing seemed immediately suspicious, but experience had taught him that the most dangerous situations often appeared perfectly normal until the moment they weren't. He settled into the booth with his back to the wall, giving him a clear view of both the main entrance and the kitchen doors. Madeline sat opposite him, her position allowing her to monitor the emergency exit and the remainder of the dining area. Atlas remained completely still within his blanket bundle, though Marcus could feel the puppy's alertness in the subtle tension of his small body. They had made it to the rendezvous point without apparent detection, but the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. A middle-aged waitress approached their table, her name tag identifying her as Darlene. "What can I get for you folks today?" she asked, her pen poised over her order pad. The coffee arrived promptly, delivered by Darlene, who set the mugs down with practiced efficiency. "Pie's coming right up," she said with a wink that could have been friendly customer service or something more significant. "Special batch today." Marcus sipped the scalding coffee, his eyes continuously scanning the diner while trying to appear casual. 3 truckers occupied stools at the counter, engaged in conversation about road conditions. An elderly couple shared breakfast near the front window. A woman in business attire worked on a laptop in a corner booth, occasionally checking her watch. None of them showed the telltale signs of surveillance operatives, the too casual interest, the strategic positioning, the subtle communication patterns. But Marcus knew the best operatives were the ones you never spotted until it was too late. 2 slices of our famous apple pie, Darlene announced, returning to their table with dessert plates. She set them down carefully, then reached into her apron pocket. "Almost forgot your napkins." As she placed the folded paper napkins beside their plates, she leaned in slightly. "Restrooms down that hall, single occupancy. Might want to check it out before your pie gets cold." Without waiting for a response, she moved on to her next table, her manner giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Madeline casually unfolded her napkin. Inside was a simple handwritten message. "Green sedan behind diner, 10 minutes." She showed it to Marcus before crumpling it in her hand. "I need to use the restroom," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Watch our things?" Marcus nodded, understanding the real purpose. Madeline would check the back exit and verify the presence of the green sedan, while he maintained their position and kept Atlas hidden. The puppy remained perfectly still within his blanket bundle, though Marcus could feel the slight rise and fall of his breathing against his side. While Madeline was gone, Marcus carefully surveyed the diner again, this time paying particular attention to anyone who might have reacted to their coded exchange with the waitress. Nothing seemed amiss, but the hairs on the back of his neck refused to settle. The bell above the main entrance chimed as 2 men entered, both wearing the unmistakable business casual attire of government agents trying to blend in. Marcus felt his muscles tense automatically. They weren't the same men from Miller's gas station, but they moved with the same purpose, scanning the room systematically while attempting to appear casual. Atlas sensed the change in Marcus's posture. From within his blanket cocoon, the puppy went from relaxed stillness to alert readiness, his small body coiling with potential energy. Somehow he had perceived the threat without seeing it. Another indication of his extraordinary training. Forcing himself to appear relaxed, Marcus took another sip of coffee and cut into his pie with deliberate movements. The two men spoke briefly to the hostess, who directed them to a table with a clear view of the entire dining area. As they sat, one of them made eye contact with Marcus for a fraction of a second, enough to confirm that this was no coincidence. Madeline returned, sliding back into the booth with a casual smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Restrooms surprisingly clean for a roadside diner," she commented loudly before leaning closer across the table. "Green sedan is there with a driver inside, and we've got company at 2 o'clock. "I saw them," Marcus confirmed quietly. "Two more just came in the front. They haven't made any moves yet, which means they're either waiting for backup or they're not entirely sure we're their targets." "We have 7 minutes until our contact expects us at the car," Madeline whispered, taking a bite of pie. "We need a distraction." Marcus considered their options, none of which seemed promising. A direct exit would expose them immediately. Waiting for their contact would give their pursuers time to position additional agents. Creating a scene would draw unwanted attention and potentially endanger civilians. The decision was made for them when the diner's front door opened again, revealing 2 more men in tactical windbreakers, poorly disguised as casual wear. One spoke into his wrist, a clear communication to others outside, while the other positioned himself near the emergency exit. "They're setting up a perimeter," Marcus murmured. "We've got maybe 60 seconds before they move on us." Madeline's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we don't give them 60 seconds. In one fluid motion, she reached across the table and knocked over both coffee mugs, sending hot liquid cascading into Marcus's lap. He leapt up with a convincing shout of pain, drawing every eye in the diner toward their table. "I'm so sorry," Madeline exclaimed, grabbing napkins and creating further commotion. "Let me help you clean that up." The momentary distraction was all they needed. As Marcus made a show of dabbing at his coffee-soaked pants, Madeline scooped up the blanket-wrapped Atlas and slipped toward the kitchen, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where they were going. Marcus followed. 30 seconds later, after ensuring the agent's attention had momentarily shifted to monitoring the exits rather than tracking their movements, he pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, nodding apologetically to the startled staff as he headed directly for the service entrance. Madeline was waiting just outside, Atlas now unwrapped and alert at her feet. "Green sedan is 50 yards. Down the alley," she whispered. "They're flashing their lights." The back door of the diner burst open behind them. One of the agents had realized their mistake sooner than anticipated. "Federal agents," he shouted. "Stop where you are." Atlas reacted before either human could process the command. The puppy launched himself at the agent with startling speed, not attacking, but executing what appeared to be a practiced distraction maneuver, darting between the man's legs and causing him to stumble forward off balance. "Run!" Marcus urged, grabbing Madeline's arm as the agent struggled to regain his footing. They sprinted down the alley, Atlas easily keeping pace beside them despite his small size. The green sedan's engine roared to life as they approached, its passenger door swinging open in invitation. "Get in," ordered a woman's voice from inside the vehicle. Marcus hesitated for a split second. This could be another trap, but a shout from behind made the decision for him. More agents had emerged from the diner, and one was raising what looked disturbingly like a weapon. Madeline dove into the back seat with Atlas while Marcus squeezed into the front passenger side. The car accelerated before he could even close his door properly, tires screeching as they shot out of the alley and into traffic. "Down!" their driver commanded, executing a sharp turn that threw them all against the doors. A black SUV appeared in the intersection ahead, attempting to cut them off. The woman behind the wheel of the green sedan was in her 40s, with short-cropped silver hair and the hard eyes of someone who had seen more than their share of combat. She handled the car with precise aggression, threading between vehicles with inches to spare as they fled the pursuing agents. "Colonel Vega sends his regards," she said, without taking her eyes off the road, swerving around a delivery truck to access a narrow side street. "You can call me Harper. I'd say it's nice to meet you, but these aren't exactly ideal circumstances." Madeline leaned forward from the back seat. "You're Jake's contact. How do we know we can trust you?" Harper executed another hairpin turn, momentarily losing their closest pursuer. "The Sentinel Promise isn't just a code phrase, Ms. Sullivan. It's a commitment your brother and his unit made to each other. When the mission went sideways, they divided their evidence between the survivors. Jake's portion was perhaps the most damning, direct links between General Whitehall and weapons shipments that ended up in insurgent hands. The specificity of this information, details that matched exactly what they had seen in Jake's video, lent credibility to Harper's claim. Still, Marcus remained wary. "Where are you taking us?" "Somewhere secure," Harper replied, checking her mirrors before accelerating through a yellow light. "We have a safe house about 30 miles outside the city. Colonel Vega is waiting there with the rest of the team." Atlas, who had been silently observing from the back seat, suddenly placed his front paws on the center console and fixed his amber eyes on Harper. The intensity of his gaze caused even the hardened operative to glance away from the road momentarily. "Yes, your mission's almost complete, little one," she said with surprising gentleness. "Jake will be very proud of you." Madeline's breath caught. "Jake? Jake is at the safe house?" Harper nodded grimly. "What's left of him? He was extracted 6 months ago from a detention facility where he'd been held and interrogated for over a year. The physical recovery has been difficult, but the psychological healing..." She trailed off, her expression darkening. "Let's just... Imte, there's a reason he couldn't come to you directly." Marcus processed this information while watching for pursuit through the side mirror. "The men at the diner, who were they exactly?" "Special Activities Division of an agency that officially doesn't exist," Harper replied, turning onto a rural highway that led away from the city. "They answer directly to General Whitehall and a few select others implicated in your brother's evidence. They operate without oversight, without limits, and without hesitation." The implications were chilling. This wasn't just a cover-up of an isolated incident, but something systemic, corruption that had infected the highest levels of military and intelligence command structures. "We're going to need to switch vehicles," Harper announced, pulling into an abandoned-looking farm equipment dealership. They'll have the sedan's description on every patrol car and surveillance camera in 3 states by now. Behind a deteriorating display barn sat 3 vehicles: a battered pickup truck, a family SUV with tinted windows, and a panel van similar to the one they had left behind at the diner. Harper bypassed all 3, heading instead for what appeared to be a storage container at the far end of the property. "Keys are under the floor mat," she instructed, stopping the sedan and killing the engine. "Blue pickup, license plate begins with TRX. It's fueled up and ready. Take the northern access road until you hit marker 42, then turn east on the dirt track. The safe house is 3 miles in. You'll see solar panels on the roof. Someone will be watching for you." Marcus frowned. "You're not coming with us?" Harper shook her head, already reaching for a duffel bag in the back of the sedan. I need to lay a false trail to buy you time. These people have resources we can only counter with misdirection. She looked directly at Madeline. Your brother risked everything to expose this conspiracy. The evidence you're carrying is our only shot at bringing down Whitehall and his network before they do even more damage. Madeline nodded, her expression resolute. We'll get it to Colonel Vega. One more thing, Harper added, her voice dropping to ensure only they could hear. When you arrive, Atlas will need to perform a final verification protocol. Jake encoded a command sequence that only the real Vega would know how to complete. It's our insurance against infiltration. Marcus realized with growing amazement just how thoroughly Jake Sullivan had planned this operation. The puppy wasn't just a courier, he was a living verification system, trained to respond only to specific command sequences known exclusively to trusted individuals. They transferred quickly to the blue pickup, with Atlas settling comfortably in the extended cab's back seat. As Madeline drove away following Harper's directions, Marcus watched through the rear window as the operative unloaded equipment from the storage container, preparing for her diversionary mission. What do you think? Madeline asked once they were back on the open road. Can we trust her, trust this Colonel Vega? Marcus considered carefully before answering. Harper knew details that matched Jake's video exactly, and Atlas didn't react negatively to her presence, which seems significant given how he's been trained to respond to threats. In the back seat, Atlas sat perfectly upright, his attention focused forward as if he understood they were discussing him. The puppy's awareness and intelligence continued to impress Marcus, reinforcing his belief that this animal represented something revolutionary in canine training. Jake is alive, Madeline whispered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. After 2 years of being told he was dead, of fighting for answers no one would give me, he's alive. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. Emotion, finally. Cracking through her disciplined exterior, Marcus reached across to briefly squeeze her shoulder. You never gave up on him. That faith is why we're here now, why Atlas found his way to you. They drove in companionable silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape gradually transformed from farmland to more densely wooded areas, the road narrowing and becoming less maintained as they headed into increasingly remote territory. At marker 42, a weathered mile marker at a nondescript intersection, they turned east onto a dirt track that wound through thick pine forest. Atlas, who had been resting, suddenly sat up, his posture alert and expectant. Whatever training had been imprinted on him had triggered a recognition of their approaching destination. We must be getting close, Marcus observed. He can sense it. The track eventually opened into a clearing where a modern cabin stood, its roof covered with solar panels, as Harper had described. The structure was designed to blend into its surroundings while providing clear sight lines in all directions, a tactical consideration that spoke to its purpose as a secure location. A man emerged from the tree line as they approached, a rifle held ready but not aimed directly at their vehicle. He signaled for them to stop at a gate across the access road, approaching cautiously once they complied. Atlas Protocol, he stated simply, looking past Marcus and Madeline to the puppy in the back seat. Atlas responded immediately, moving forward between the front seats to sit at perfect attention, his amber eyes fixed on the armed man. Echo Sierra 712, the man continued, his expression giving nothing away. Atlas tilted his head to the right, then raised his left paw precisely 3 times before emitting a single sharp bark. The man's posture relaxed slightly. "Sentinel, confirmed. Follow me to the house. Leave your weapons in the vehicle for now. Standard protocol until full verification is complete." They parked where indicated and were escorted into the cabin, Atlas walking precisely at Madeline's heel without being commanded to do so. The interior was spartanly furnished, but equipped with advanced communications equipment and security systems that rivaled military command posts. 4 people awaited them inside, 3 men and 1 woman, all with the unmistakable bearing of special operations personnel. Their focus, however, was immediately drawn to the figure seated in a wheelchair near the fireplace. Jake Sullivan bore little resemblance to the vibrant ranger in the photographs at Madeline's cabin. His frame was gaunt, his once muscular build diminished by long captivity. A jagged scar ran from his right temple down to his jaw, and his left arm was positioned oddly, suggesting permanent nerve damage. But his eyes, the same amber shade. As Atlas's burned with undiminished intensity. "Maddie," he said, his voice rough from what might have been disuse or injury. "You made it." Madeline stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the reality of her brother after believing him dead for so long. Then, with a small sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, she crossed the room and carefully embraced him, mindful of his. "Apparent injuries. You stubborn, impossible man," she whispered, tears streaming freely down her face. "I knew you weren't dead. I knew it." Atlas approached slowly, his disciplined demeanor giving way to unmistakable recognition and joy. He whined, softly, pressing against Jake's legs with gentle insistence until the man reached down to stroke his head. "Mission accomplished, soldier," Jake told the puppy, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought them home safe." Marcus hung back, giving the siblings their moment of reunion while maintaining awareness of the other operatives in the room. The one who had met them at the gate approached, extending his hand. "Colonel Michael Vega," he introduced himself. "I owe you a debt for bringing Sullivan's evidence and his sister safely to us. We've been trying to build this case for nearly 2 years, working completely off the grid to avoid Whitehall's surveillance network." Marcus shook the offered hand, studying the man who apparently led this clandestine operation. "The thumb drive? We'll complete our evidence package," Vega confirmed. "With what Sullivan managed to document before his capture, combined with what the other survivors have gathered, we finally have enough to bypass the compromised channels and take this directly to individuals we know aren't implicated. The corruption is extensive, but not total." Jake looked up from his reunion with Madeline and Atlas, his expression becoming grave. "We don't have much time. Whitehall's people were close enough to intercept you at the diner, which means their net is tightening. We need to move everything tonight." Colonel Vega nodded in agreement. "The extraction team is on standby. Helicopter arrives at 2200 hours. We'll split into 3 groups. Different destinations, different evidence packages. Redundancy is our best protection." The reality of their situation settled over Marcus with renewed weight. This was far larger than rescuing a German shepherd, puppy from euthanasia, or solving the mystery of a military tag. They had stumbled into a covert war between factions within their own government, one seeking to expose corruption, the other willing to kill to keep it hidden. As the team began preparations for their imminent departure, Marcus found himself wondering how his life had changed so dramatically in just over 24 hours. Yesterday, his biggest concern had been the shelter's overcrowding. Now he was part of an operation that could potentially reshape military command structures and bring down powerful figures who had betrayed their oaths. Atlas padded over to him, pressing a warm, furry head against his hand in what felt remarkably like gratitude. The puppy, who had so nearly been just another statistic on the euthanasia list, now sat at the center of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of power. A living symbol of how single acts of compassion could cascade into world-changing consequences. "We've got movement on the perimeter sensors," one of Vega's team announced suddenly, her attention fixed on a monitoring station. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the west. ETA 3 minutes. The room erupted into focused activity as the team shifted seamlessly into defensive operations. Jake wheeled himself toward a communications console, his damaged body belying the sharp command presence he still projected. "They found us sooner than expected," he stated grimly. "Change of plans. We move now. Alpha team, prepare the diversion. Bravo, secure the evidence packages. Charlie, get the primary targets to the extraction point." Colonel Vega approached Marcus and Madeline, his expression deadly serious. "Our helicopter extraction isn't for 3 hours. We need to evacuate you and the evidence immediately via the emergency route. Anders will take you through the tunnel system to the secondary rendezvous point." A young woman in tactical gear stepped forward, nodding briskly. "This way. Bring only what's essential." As they prepared to move, Jake reached out to grasp Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing value in a puppy when others saw only inconvenience. We designed the operation with multiple contingencies, but none of it would have mattered if Atlas had been put down before his mission could begin." The gravity of those words settled over Marcus as he realized just how close they had come to losing everything this group had worked and sacrificed for. A different shelter worker, a busier day, a minor change in processing procedures. Any small variance might have resulted in Atlas being euthanized before his true purpose could be discovered. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles grew more distinct. Their window of escape was narrowing by the second. As Anders led them toward a concealed access panel in the floor, Atlas trotted alongside, his training once again evident in his focused alertness. The puppy, who had been scheduled for euthanasia less than 48 hours ago, was now their guide to safety, carrying with him not just coded behaviors and specialized training, but the hope of exposing a truth that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. Here's a concise ending to bring the story to a conclusion. After escaping through the tunnel system, Marcus, Madeline, and Atlas reached the secondary extraction point where a helicopter waited. As they lifted off, the cabin erupted in gunfire below. Whitehall's men had arrived too late. 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in a secure military courtroom, watching as General Whitehall and his conspirators faced justice. The evidence Atlas had carried proved irrefutable, exposing a weapons trafficking operation that had cost American lives. Jake Sullivan, still recovering but improving daily, testified via secure video link. His testimony, combined with the documented evidence, ensured the corrupt officials would never again betray their country. "What happens now?" Marcus asked Madeline as they left the courthouse. She smiled, looking down at Atlas, who trotted between them. No longer a puppy on death row, he now wore an official service dog vest, his reward for completing the most important mission of his young life. "Jake's being transferred to a rehabilitation center near my home," she said, "and this little hero needs a family." Atlas looked up at Marcus, amber eyes filled with the same intelligence that had first caught his attention at the shelter. "I think he's already found one," Marcus replied. "If you enjoyed this incredible story of how a helpless German Shepherd puppy on death row changed the course of a national conspiracy, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next amazing rescue story. We share new, inspirational animal journeys every week that will warm your heart and restore your faith in humanity. Leave a comment letting us know what you thought of Atlas's incredible journey, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes the smallest souls make the biggest difference. See you in our next video.